Good morning. Thank you, dear colleagues. ICOM Georgia, ICOM APR, Museum Union, everybody who's here. I had never thought I would be here at a time like this. You're brave, I admire you deeply, and I wish your struggle all the best. How far does your tolerance go? This is a photo from a theatre play called Catarina and the Beauty of Killing Fascists by Portuguese playwright and theatre director Tiago Rodrigues, which premiered in Portugal in 2020 and has since traveled around the world: Switzerland, Austria, Italy, Norway, France, Belgium, Spain, Greece, and the US. And this is the story. For over 70 years, one Portuguese family has gathered at their country house for an annual ritual, the execution of a fascist. All the women in this family share the same name, Caterina, and they've passed this tradition down through generations. It is now the turn of the youngest Caterina to kill her fascist, kidnapped on purpose. It is a day of celebration, beauty, and death. However, Caterina is unable to kill and refuses to do so. Family conflict erupts, accompanied by several questions. What is a fascist? Is there a place for violence in the fight for a better world? Can we violate the rules of democracy to better defend it? And now a spoiler alert, sorry for those who haven't seen the play yet. As conflict erupts in the family, its members end up killing each other. The fascist is free and starts a monologue, which can last for as long as the audience is ready to tolerate it. How long is that? In the play's recent presentation at Brooklyn Academy of Music in the US, a technician in the team decided to register how long it would take in each performance for the first member of the audience to react to the fascist's monologue, and then for the rest of the audience to join. And these are the times. The sooner we react, the sooner we can bring that speech to an end. Many of you may have heard of Austrian-British philosopher Karl Popper, who in 1945, in his essay, The Open Society and Its Enemies, he articulated the paradox of tolerance, a philosophical concept suggesting that if a society extends tolerance to those who are intolerant, it risks enabling the eventual dominance of intolerance, thereby undermining the very principle of tolerance. In the book, The Paradox of Democracy and Its Enemies, Greece, France, political scientist Sotiris Vandoros moves further back from 1945 and from Popper to the 20s and the 30s. He refers to Karl Löwenstein, a German lawyer and political scientist, regarded as one of the prominent figures of constitutional law in the 20th century, who established the theoretical foundations of militant democracy to battle anti-democratic mass movements. The mechanism of democracy is the Trojan horse with which the enemy enters the city, Löwenstein stated. And he believes that democracies need to be much less committed to a formalistic idea of democracy and of legitimacy, and to procedures and abstract democratic and liberal principles. And this is because in this way they tend to become dormant until they reach a breaking point, when it may be too late. Instead of this lukewarm attitude, they should become much more proactively combative against the extremist phenomenon. Before Löwenstein, Hans Kelsen, a jurist, legal and political philosopher, and the principal architect of the 1920 Austrian constitution, which with amendments is still in operation today, defended something different, defended that without exception, democracy should grant in full the same rights to the intolerant, to its detractors. If it does not do so, it has destroyed itself before its enemies can inflict it any harm. By the way, both Löwenstein and Kelsen had to live in exile after the Nazis took over in Germany. In the same article, Sotiris Vandoros refers yet to one more political scientist, Ami Pedachschour, and his concept of immunized democracy. Although it is not an opposing or incompatible approach to the concept of militant democracy, Pedachschour distinguishes it in terms of its goals, means, actors, and fields of application. Immunized democracy supports the positive defense of democratic values and institutions. It functions as a vaccine against any anti-democratic virus. It creates immunity through the broader education system, not just the school, and the organized civil society. In these last years, the world, in different countries, and some considered strong democracies, the world has experienced a number of breaking points. A definite turn towards autocratic protectors, an increasingly intolerant, offensive, at times vicious discourse towards whoever is considered to be the other, the one not fitting a norm, the one not respecting the majority's traditions. And in this context, we also tend to confuse freedom of speech and hate speech. We tend to forget the mechanisms of democracy and the tools given to us by the rule of law. We also tend to undervalue the incidence of extremism, hate, moral and physical violence. As long as we don't feel it on our skin, it is not important. It is not something to worry about. We shouldn't be losing our time with it, or we give it visibility and promotion by naming it. And then, one day, it is too late. Thus, more than expressing shock and consternation on recent electoral results or attempts, often successful, of political interference in museum work, I'm more interested in questioning myself and all of us on where we were, what we did at the time all this was in the making. How did we contribute as citizens working in museums and as museums for the immunization of our democracy? And perhaps this is a good moment to define fascism. In a recent speech at the NEMO conference, I questioned whether we should be talking to fascists at all. And later that day, at the farewell dinner, a colleague who was sitting next to me asked me, how do you define fascism? And that's a good point. We shouldn't take anything for granted. Fascist is not just a swear word we tell someone whom we don't like. It does have a negative connotation for most of us, but do we know what it actually means? Fascism is the politics of us against them, us and them. Fear and anger is what drives people to the polls. Steve Bannon, if you remember him, the previous director of the Trump campaign, said in an interview in 2018, how is this fear and anger built in order to cause division in society? The techniques, as I was discussing with Emma a little while ago, are known to us, and Jason Stanley analyzes them thoroughly and clearly in his book, How Fascism Works. What is fascism? What are these techniques? A mythic past, always, propaganda, anti-intellectualism, unreality, hierarchy, victimhood, law and order, sexual anxiety, rural authenticity, destruction of social welfare and unity. This is what I meant when I used the term fascism in my speech at the NEMO conference, and these are tactics that should ring a bell that our democracy might be losing its immunity, that our democracy probably needs us to care for it. So 2 more book references before I start concentrating on culture and museums. In Children of the Void, From Individualist Impasse to Citizen Awakening, French journalist Raphael Glucksmann tells us that in 2017, a retired worker approached him after a public talk and said to him, I have got 2 children and I don't understand them anymore. They have work, they are married, they have children. Each has a beautiful car, a home, a mobile phone. They eat and drink as much as they want. They are not rich, but they are richer than I was. Even so, they vote for Le Pen. Even so, they believe that everything today is worse than it was yesterday and will be even worse tomorrow. They're afraid of the world, of the Arabs, of Europe. How can this be explained? So they engaged in a discussion, and approximately half an hour later, the gentleman came to the following conclusion. We were poor, but we had the union, the factory, the party. Those who believed also had the church. The union, above all, was a big family. Now, in her book, How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship, Turkish author Ece Temelkuren writes that today's world is an entirely different mass of people, one with a more limited vocabulary, smaller dreams for the world, and less faith on the collective survival of humanity. This is a world where we see again and again the humiliated greeting the perpetrator as their savior. Should we wish to consider then the role of culture in general and of museums in particular, this is where I believe we should turn to and look for a purpose. And by purpose, I mean more than mounting exhibitions and organizing activities that focus on our personal, professional interests instead of the needs of the society and communities around us. By purpose, I mean caring for life, people, the nature, for solidarity, for knowledge and the capacity to think, for imagination and the capacity to dream. Now, focusing on culture, I will start with books and libraries. PEN America stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. They champion the freedom to write, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. PEN America has registered only this year 10,000 contested books, meaning books that were removed or were asked to be removed from the shelves of school libraries and public libraries. Usually these books deal with race, racism, LGBTQI+ issues, slavery, the genocide of indigenous Americans, religion. On too many instances, the citizens asking for a book to be removed haven't even read it. It's the title, it's the perceived subject, lists circulating by groups such as Moms for Liberty. The toll on librarians has been very heavy. Some people have resigned from their posts, others are struggling with their mental health. A recent report regarding the situation in the US, published by the Knight Foundation, showed some very relevant results. First of all, that 78% of people trust their public schools to select appropriate materials for the children and the young people. It also found that most Americans feel informed about efforts to ban books in schools, yet just 3% of respondents said that they had personally engaged on that issue, with 2% getting involved on the side of maintaining access to books and 1% seeking to restrict access. And do you know how that looks? It looks like this. Do you think this is a healthy democracy? This is not only happening in the US. I chose pieces of news in English because it is our common language here, but it's happening elsewhere too. This year I attended a session organized online by librarians in Brazil, also my association, Access Culture, organized in Lisbon, etc., etc. It's all too similar. So when I first heard of an incident involving the launch of a book in Portugal, a book written in inclusive language, I paid attention. It was a bit more than a year ago that an extremist group entered the bookshop and started shouting in order to express its objection regarding this book. They were not interested in dialogue, they just wished to disrupt the event. I waited and waited to see how the Portuguese culture sector would consider this act of censorship, and I referred to the whole sector, not just the sector related to books. And there was silence. The only exception among the organizations I follow came from 2 theaters. One theater that is in the neighborhood of the bookshop where the incident took place, and a theater dedicated to children and young people. And at the time, I wrote in my blog, Musing on Culture, that although we might think we are far away from the US, we are really very, very close to it. It is our silence and relativization, I wrote, it is the way we normalize certain acts and discourses that give space to the enemies of democracy. Our defense of freedom of expression and the non-erasure of history must be informed, permanent and unequivocal. In the course of a bit more than a year, the attacks on books, namely female authors of children's books, multiplied in Portugal. Still, the wider culture sector remains silent. Last April, I co-organized a debate on the role of culture organizations in declining democracies, and one of our guests was Emily Drabinski, which at the time was the president of the American Library Association. And I asked her whether we were exaggerating if we wished to address the slightest attempt of intolerance, of hate speech, of harassment. And her answer was, we're in this situation because we've been giving up inches for decades. Each of these moments has to be brought to light. We can't concede an inch. Each event needs to be paid a lot of attention, and everybody must know about it. When Emily was appointed president of ALA in July 2023, she said that we need to make trouble, good trouble, the kind of trouble that matters, the kind of trouble I became a librarian to get into, and we need to make it together, building the collective power necessary to preserve and expand the public good. Now, allow me to go back to Portugal for a second, where the wider culture sector, including museums, did not feel that far-right populist attacks on children's books had something to do with them, that it demanded any action on behalf of all of us. Because a far-right organized group came knocking, to put it politely, on a museum's door. In October, the National Museum of Natural History and Science organized a debate entitled Around the World in 80 Catastrophes. They aimed at discussing collective memory and public space and to question what symbolic, historical, social, and political importance do statues, monuments, memorials, and toponymy present in public space. Who should decide what will be remembered and how it will be remembered? How do changes in social values influence our relationship with the past? This didn't please the far right, though, and they considered that the country's mythic past was being undermined. They showed up at the event, which eventually had to take place behind closed doors, and it was only live-streamed. They declared victory in the social media for cancelling the event. They didn't exactly cancel it. It took place online, but wasn't this an attack to the museum's, guests, and other participants' freedom? Very few people know about this incident because it didn't make news, and even if you search for it today, you won't find anything, and I find this worrying. And it is not an isolated incident, as you can imagine. Early in October, I attended the final conference of the project chapter, which means Challenging Populist Truth-Making in Europe, the Role of Museums in a Digital Post-Truth European Society. And Julia Lesser, one of the researchers, briefly shared some findings with us. Right in the beginning, Julia explained that populist agency lies not only with populist governments, but also with organized protest groups which diffuse manifestations of the people. These manifestations may include the complicity and implication of museums and museum staff. In more concrete terms, this research gathered evidence on the following. Spotlight 1, quiet transformations and self-censorship. Secretly, quietly, museums and museum staff remove references that might provoke populist politicians and organized groups. There is concern about losing funding or even one's job. There's not an open discussion on certain topics among museum staff. Risk is avoided, and our own freedom and that of others is conditioned. Spotlight 2, political violence and exhaustion. Anonymous threats, phone calls, SMS, a constant pressure to break people's spirit and mental health, incidents that museum workers describe as intimidating and exhausting. The aim is to disrupt museum activities when they promote issues populists are not fond of, such as equality, diversity, social pluralism, and pressure to promote a narrative that speaks of a great country and a great past. Practices of disruption include budget cuts, replacement and direct appointment of museum management, dismissal of museum directors, forms of harassment, and political violence. Spotlight 3, populist traps. As a museum director being interviewed by Julia Lesser said, populism creates a situation where there's no objectivity anymore, and no one can judge what's actually a fact. If we go back to how fascism works, I believe we shall be able to see the signs, to see the connection. And it is necessary to act on those signs, apart from being able to identify them as soon as they appear, so that we don't reach a breaking point, so that it's not too late. Just last month, little after the annual conference in Sibiu, NEMO Executive Board issued a statement entitled Museums Under Pressure. The statement is informed by discussions that took place in the conference that had the title, Can We Talk? Museums Facing Polarization, and also findings from an August 2024 survey conducted by NEMO. Both underscore that political pressure, both direct and indirect, can lead museums to self-censor their programming and communication, particularly on sensitive topics. The board stated that as a network representing over 30,000 museums, NEMO will continue to serve as a reference point for museums navigating challenging circumstances by providing the space for exchange and the support in defense of the values and principles that make museums society's trusted institutions. Going back to Karl Löwenstein, the theorist of militant democracy, he views fascism as a technique for seizing power, by instrumentally appropriating democratic processes and exploiting to its advantage the opportunities provided by parliamentary institutions and the rule of law. At the same time, by acting as a disruptive element, it erodes the effectiveness and prestige of liberal democracy, which it gradually undermines from within. At the NEMO conference, my position was that we shouldn't be dialoguing with fascists. And I felt that this didn't come down well with some people. A colleague actually told me that this too was a way of polarizing us and them. And I felt that we might have a rather romanticized idea about dialogue, and we tend to view ourselves as good Samaritans. There are two main reasons why I believe we shouldn't be looking for dialogue with fascists. First of all, because we tend to react to their discourse, their arguments, their lies. We aim at doing it ethically, responsibly, with facts, and thus we almost always lose that battle. A second reason we shouldn't be aiming at dialogue is that it is a waste of time. They are not interested in dialogue, they are pretending to be dialoguing. They scream their slogans, share them extensively on social media, they claim victory for disrupting events. When they interrupt a book launch, or when they don't allow people to see a play, and they physically attack members of the audience, as it recently happened in Sofia, Bulgaria. It was the premiere of Arms and the Man, a play by George Bernard Shaw, directed by John Malkovich. They are not interested in dialogue when they do that. Another common feature in these incidents is the stance taken by the police. In Portugal, they remove the book author from the stage for safety reasons, but not the disruptors from the room. In Sofia, they didn't make sure members of the audience could enter the theater safely by controlling the attackers. And according to Bulgarian director and Oscar-winning artist Theo Ushev, a policeman scolded him for having provoked them. It looks rather bleak, doesn't it? Is there any hope? Hope is a gift you don't have to surrender. A power you don't have to throw away, writes Rebecca Solnit in Hope in the Dark. And this is a book about activism and social change in the last 4 or 5 decades. It is a book that reminds us how unpredictable change is and how potent popular power can be. Hope is not about closing our eyes to bleak realities, it is about facing them and getting inspired by all the marvelous things that have happened in the past, and we should know about them, and acting. Power, writes Solnit, comes from the shadows and the margins. Our hope is in the dark, around the edges, not in the limelight of central stage. I read and reread these words and remind myself that change does not come from the many. We might be feeling lonely and powerless, but the truth is that we are not alone, we are not few, and we have power when we come together and create a community for the common good. So what is it that I'm hoping for? Considering that we already know the tactics, I hope we shall be able to build a strategy beforehand and not after we see ourselves involved in an overwhelming, violent crisis. On 25 November, in this online debate organized by Access Culture, Jana Golombek, who's a curator at the Zeche-Zollner Museum in Dortmund, shared with us the feelings of being attacked by far-right groups regarding the exhibition This is Colonial. She precisely told us it was overwhelming. There was a moment one didn't know who to trust anymore. In what she describes as a shitstorm, the museum started being bombarded on social media and through phone calls, and members of the AfD, the far-right party in Germany, were stationed outside the museum, and the only reason they didn't come in is because they would have to pay the ticket to do so. So, what are Jana's learnings from this experience and what she shared with all of us? Prepare for the crisis beforehand. It is going to hit you. Get everybody together to talk about it. Know from the beginning who will have your back, who will protect and support you, and if possible, put it in writing. Prepare guidelines and train the staff, especially those working in communication or doing guided tours, because their work may be seriously disrupted by those groups. Don't keep quiet and to yourself. Share this widely with your networks and create the networks if they don't exist, and help support with your experience and guidelines also smaller museums and their staff who might be more vulnerable. Julia Lesser also took part in this debate and told us, be together, be informed, know what's going on, get involved, and don't shy away from dealing with issues that will trigger the far right. We need to build solidarity among museum professionals and beyond, so that people don't feel alone. Julia is one of the co-founders of the network Haltung, an association that aims to make politically motivated attacks on museums, exhibition halls, and cultural workers visible. They document these incidents of political influence, instrumentalization, and appropriation of museum work, but also the targeted attacks on museums and museum employees. They promote exchange and are a contact point for those affected and those seeking advice. Thus, I hope for a strategy and networks of solidarity. But I also hope that we shall be able to use the tools both immunized democracy and militant democracy place at our disposal. While we work through our governance models, education services, programming, communication to help our societies get immunity against populism and extremism, we should also be able to draw clear red lines and not continue to extend our tolerance beyond what should be tolerated in a democracy. Most of our countries have strong constitutions defending the dignity and rights of all citizens and of all taxpayers, and they have laws. We should use them to defend our democracy. We shouldn't continue being naive and tolerate the intolerance, who use its mechanisms in order to subvert it. Finally, I hope we shall be able to do all this on our own terms, our own narrative, instead of trying to react to absurd, unfounded arguments, conspiracy theories, alternative facts, you name it. We should build our own vision for a just future, not one of anger, fear, and neglect, but one of dignity, possibility, solidarity, and hope. And I'm sure some of you remember the film No, regarding the 1988 Chilean referendum on whether dictator Augusto Pinochet should become president for 8 years under resumed civilian rule. The No side won that referendum with 56%. And if you remember the intense discussion among the members of the No campaign, they didn't win because they tried to unveil and remind people of all the crimes they truly suffered under the dictatorship, but they won because they told people, Chile, la alegría ya viene. Chile, joy is coming, joy is on its way. I recently read Ramin Jahanbegloo's book, Nonviolence, and it quotes Václav Havel saying that, "I'm convinced that we will never build a democratic state based on the rule of law if we do not at the same time build a state that is, regardless of how unscientific this might sound to the ears of a political scientist, humane, moral, intellectual and spiritual, and cultural." Thank you very much.